it's in...
Most of it is in English.
Yeah, but most of it's in English, yeah.
Like two Dutch.
Yeah. And I scanned through it this week. Interesting stuff. Okay, and yeah, sure. Okay. And it links quite nicely to the way we've just finished with Jeff, which is talking about publications, but in this case it's about newspapers.
Okay.
Thank you, Stijn.
Thanks for the introduction, Dave, and for having me this week. I want to begin with a short anecdote. During a popular Flemish radio quiz of the 1960s, the contestants were asked to name the author of the classic Flemish novel The Lion of Flanders. Right away, they confidently answered Karel van Veenendaal. For those who know their Flemish literary history, this was of course not the right answer, because Hendrik Conscience wrote that famous 19th century novel. The writer the contestants had named was actually a newspaper journalist who had been Flanders' most prolific chronicler of cycling sport for over 5 decades. Now, this little example shows, of course, how influential media are in shaping our perception of sports, and this is of course no new insight, as many analyses of sports media discourses show. Our image of sports is often a highly mediated one. Now, this was especially the case in cycling, as a sport which certainly before the 1960s was better suited to newspaper readers than to actual spectators. Not only was its public image strongly influenced by the press, the latter also crucially shaped the sport's very development as part of a powerful so-called sports media industrial complex. The case of popular races such as the Tour de France, which was actually organized by a sports paper, illustrate this. However, there have actually been few studies which focus on this press as an actor in its own right. Often most sports press studies, certainly in cycling, look at it as a producer of discourses of class, gender or identity, but do not fully analyze the context in which these discourses took shape. And my aim in this paper is to really look at this sports press as a sector which is interesting in its own right. Firstly, I want to argue that while this sport press, on the one hand, had of course a specific dynamic, its development was also closely linked to developments in the broader press as a whole. Secondly, I want to show how this press's main protagonist, journalists, became a distinct socio-professional group during the period I'm focusing on before the Second World War, which was defined by specific professional practices. And I will do this by zooming in on cycling journalism in Belgium before the Second World War. Now, this is an interesting case for several reasons. Not only was cycling's huge popularity in Belgium made it a culturally influential sort of national sport, it also made it one of the main catalysts for the development of the country's sporting journalism. Secondly, this sporting journalism was always, in a sense, a twofold one. As a bilingual country, Belgium is, as you might know, divided in a Dutch-speaking Flanders and French-speaking Wallonia. And with two language groups, the country thus also saw sports journalists in both Dutch and French appear. And lastly, I think that this continental case can serve as interesting material for comparing the sports press development in both continental Europe and Britain. Now, in Belgium, as in the rest of Europe, cycling sports' initial fate was intimately entwined with that of the press from early on. Although there were earlier and mostly unsuccessful initiatives in earlier decades, it was especially when cycling fast transformed into a professional and highly commercial sport in the early 1890s that a specialized cycling sports press began to develop in Belgium. Throughout the latter decade, really dozens of periodicals dedicated to cycling sports specifically appeared. And apart from being entwined with cycling's growing popularity, this fast growth was also influenced by broader changes in the Belgian press in general, which during this decade and the decade preceding that witnessed incisive transformations, not only in the overall number of titles being published, which also grew exponentially, but also how the latter represented the news changed as the commercial possibilities of kind of sensationalist reporting and incorporating popular subjects became increasingly influential. So attracting readers became sort of a legitimate goal, and one which at that suited the emerging sports press perfectly. And in enlarging their market share, cycling journals were especially influenced by what was happening in the equally booming French sports press, where journals, mostly cycling journals, had identified the organization of their own bicycle races as a sort of king's road to increasing their market share. So in 1891 already, the new weekly paper, La Coulisse, pioneered the strategy in Belgium by organizing one of the first major road races in the country, actually. Now, I won't go too deep into this 19th century sporting press, although it had some notable developments which were to be important for what happened later decades. The case of the paper Le Vélos, for instance, which was established in 1893 and was actually the first daily newspaper dedicated to cycling, or indeed to sports in general, to appear in the country, and which became really like the flagship of 1890s Belgian cycling. Also important was the fact that through cycling, even general newspapers, so non-specialized ones, began to gradually devote attention to sport, although this was often still limited to short, matter-of-fact reports. Now, around 1900, however, both the cycling press and cycling itself experienced a crisis. While popular throughout the previous decade, cycling had remained a mostly upper and middle class practice. However, new technology-based sports like motoring now growingly attracted the attention of those same bourgeois sportsmen, leading to a decline in cycling's popularity. And being dependent on the sports fortunes, its press stalled as well. And the fact that this Le Vélos changed its name to L'Automobile Vélos in 1902 perhaps best indicates this sort of shifting focus of bourgeois sporting sensibility. Now, this was not to say cycling disappeared completely from the press. There were some new but often short-lived sports titles, like the 1902 L'Étoile Sportive, which still paid attention to it, although it now had to share pages with up-and-coming sports like football or athletics. In Le Sportsman, for instance, which was really the early 1900s only sort of sporting daily paper, cycling initially rarely made the headlines, but soon things started to change again, however. In 1905, this Le Sportsman began paying a lot more attention to cycling again, and even organized its own races. Now, what was happening was that the bicycle was now becoming increasingly available to the country's lower classes as well. And as these working class cyclists were growingly eager to race, the sport experienced new popularity. And especially around 1908, the first international successes of this new breed of working class racers, which was epitomized by the Flemish rider Cyril van Houwaert, who won the prestigious French Paris-Roubaix race in 1908, definitively created a sort of new momentum for the sport, which also reinvigorated the sports press. And one of the first to pick up on this new popularity of cycling was actually a general daily newspaper called La Dernière Heure. Established in 1906, this title with politically liberal leanings was one of the first to be really modeled after the emerging English tabloid papers, which of course included a strong focus on sports. And this paper had a cycling section from its earliest beginnings onwards. And in 1908 it even successfully organized its own racing event, the ambitious 8-day long Tour of Belgium, Tour de Belgique. And what is interesting is that La Dernière's success soon inspired new specialized sports titles as well. In 1907, for instance, the Brussels sports promoter Albert Collignon founded the journal Tous les Sports, All Sports. Although soon quitting this title after an argument with its co-founder, he published a new Le Vélo a year later, which soon became a big success. It was renamed as Vélosport in 1911 and really came to dominate French language cycling reporting in the coming years together with La Dernière. Now, what was also new after 1908 was that sports papers were now also founded in Flanders, in the Dutch-speaking part of the country. Whether they were short-lived regional titles, illustrated monthlies, or big, almost daily papers like so-called Sportvriend. And all of these papers devoted a lot, if not the most, attention to cycling. Now, that these were indeed Dutch language titles was indeed a notable development, as some exceptions notwithstanding. The Belgian sports press had previously been a mostly French-speaking affair. Now, here as well, however, this really diverse early Flemish sporting presscape soon saw one specific paper rise to dominance. Also having a really strong focus on cycling, this paper, Sportwereld, first appeared in September 1912 as a successful attempt of a Catholic publishing group, the Société Anonyme Belge d'Imprimerie, to provide a Flemish Catholic-owned alternative to popular liberal papers like La Dernière, to which end it attracted many of those other Flemish sporting papers' most prolific reporters. Now, what is interesting is that in 1911 already, this same publishing company, the Société Anonyme, had already bought Le Vélo from Albert Collignon, who remained its director, and in this way, two of the country's leading sports papers were effectively in the hands of the same publisher, and would remain so until the mid-1920s. Indeed, sports news commercial potential elicited a lot of attention from mainstream publishers before the war. Those involved in starting up the new Flemish Catholic daily paper De Standaard in 1914, for instance, also considered incorporating a sports section and had very close contacts with journalists from the Sportwereld to this end. However, the existing Catholic papers generally still featured little sports reporting, as did most of the country's socialist newspapers, as both kinds of papers still often criticized sports as being respectively morally dangerous or as a sort of distraction from the class struggle. Now, the German invasion of 1914 interrupted this growing sporting press, as both Sportwereld and Collignon's Vélosport ceased publication. They returned soon after the war, however, with Vélosport even being actually the first paper published in Brussels after the armistice in November 1918. So the 1920s really proved to be their golden age, with both continuously expanding their sales. And while both papers also growingly reported on other sports in this decade, cycling really continued to dominate its pages. Not only because it was the preferred sport of both papers' leading journalists, Belgian races' consistent international success also kept its popularity high. So what we see is that in the space of, give or take, 10 years, the sports press had become really a distinct aspect of the Belgian presscape. A process in which cycling played a crucial role. And this was especially visible in how these sports papers' main protagonists, the journalists, evolved. In many ways, they too were part of a much broader professionalization process in Belgian journalism taking place in this period, in which a formerly disparate group of part-time, mostly political reporters, who saw themselves actually more as intellectuals than as newspapermen, really turned into a sort of specialized profession. Now, what we see is that from the late 1900s onwards, there is a growing group of really full-time employed professional sports reporters, especially at these kind of specialized titles like the Velo Sport. Not every sports reporter was a full-time professional, of course. Most of these titles had a small core team of contributors and a much larger one of mostly part-time and regionally based correspondents. Nevertheless, these journalists did increasingly become a distinct social professional group. And perhaps a very good indication of this fact was their establishment of their own professional association, the Association Professionnelle Belge des Journalistes Sportifs, in 1913, which was long dominated by cycling journalists as well. Secondly, there were a number of practices which really defined them as a distinct profession as well. And in the case of the cycling journalists, this was first of all, and also a bit ironically, entailed their non-journalistic sporting activities. Because as pillars of this entwinement between sport, press and industry, many were at the same time also directors of cycling tracks, managers of specific racers, or had very good relations with bicycle manufacturers and the racing teams the latter sponsored. However, these activities were actually rarely questioned as endangering those journalists' professional independence. On the contrary, they were thought of as contributing to making the latter really knowledgeable chroniclers of the sport. And in this sense, organizing road races equally remained a defining practice as a sort of key to increasing Pepers's market share, as was, for instance, visible in Sportwereld's race, the Tour of Flanders, which it started in 1913. Now, easy to organize these events were not, however, and in this respect, I think the adoption of the automobile by the press, by the sporting press, from the 1900s onwards, really meant a crucial step forwards in both the organization of these races and the development of cycling sports journalism. So while cycling reporters in the 1890s still had to make do by, for instance, train travel to gather the intel for their race reports, this new vehicle really opened up new roads. Not only could now one easily scout the course of a road race one was organizing, journalists were now also able to follow riders from up close for the duration of an event, making their reports much more detailed and also much more colorful. And in this sense, this kind of view from the windscreen became the journalist's perspective par excellence on cycling, and made this car a sort of essential tool in making the sporting news. And hence by the 1920s, every major road race was indeed followed by a real procession of cars packed with journalists. Now, not only were these specific practices crucial in forming sports journalism as a profession, within this profession there also grew a number of what I would like to call distinct sort of ideal type journalist profiles, which were crucial in driving this sporting press forward. And I'm going to really shortly look at two of them. And the first one is that of what I would like to call the entrepreneur. Now, this type of sports journalist was especially in charge of the practical, organizational, business side of this press. And I think the man on the left, Leon van den Houten, is probably a very good representative of this type. So, Van den Houten, as somebody who spoke both Dutch and French fluently, was active in the French-speaking as well as the Flemish sports press from the late 1900s on, and specialized in organizing road races initially. So, because of these organizing skills, he got himself noticed by the earlier mentioned Société Anonyme, who put him in charge of Sportwereld in 1912. And not only did he manage to attract some of its early key contributors to this paper, he was also the main catalyst behind its flagship Tour of Flanders race. And certainly after the First World War, Van den Houten played a big role in the Belgian sports press. So not only did he lead Sportwereld to growing popularity, he also at the same time established a number of new illustrated sports weeklies in both French and Dutch. Okay. Between 1923 and 1928, moreover, he directed Les Sports as well, from which Albert Collignon had retired. And as such, he was a driving force really behind many of the period's sports press ventures. Now, the leading entrepreneurial role of someone like Van den Houten did not necessarily mean he also wrote for the journals he directed. For that, he mostly relied on what I would like to call ideologues, which were sort of limited number of prolific and highly productive reporters who endowed these papers with a characteristic and commercially attractive discourse. And perhaps one of these ideologues' defining features was that despite the papers they worked for their clear commercial objectives, writing on cycling to them also served clear social purposes. Because they really saw cycling as a sort of antidote to the manifold threats of modernity, to the nation's physical and mental resilience, and thus proclaimed the sport as a sort of means of educating and bettering the masses. And a very good example of this, and I will finish with that, is the figure of the editor-in-chief of Sportwereld from 1913 onwards, Karel van Wijnendale. Now, Van Wijnendale began his career writing for papers, for other papers in the late 1900s, before transferring to Sportwereld on the request of Van den Houten, and soon really became crucial in shaping this paper's discourse. And to him especially, cycling journalism was not just about entertainment. As a staunch supporter of the so-called Flemish movement, a cultural and also political movement in these decades, which propagated the emancipation of Belgium's economically, culturally disadvantaged Flemish population, his discourse on cycling was one which was really drenched in sort of pro-Flemish sentiments. And through cycling, he hoped to realize the sort of same social, cultural renewal others try to achieve through politics or literature. And indeed, even Sportwereld's yellow paper and black lettering, which were characteristic of the paper, were already a symbol of this kind of pro-Flemish stance, as it were the same colors as the Flemish flag. So, to conclude, what we see here with these ideologues is, again, a crucial field of tension in this early cycling journalism, which was present in the broader Belgian press as well. So, while increasingly becoming these commercially oriented professional newspapermen, many of these journalists also still cultivated a sort of self-image as being sort of cultured and socially responsible men of letters. Now, I had still a small part on the developments in the 1930s, but I will leave that out since we're running out of time. So, just to conclude, I think it will be interesting to compare this early development of the sports press in Belgium with other parts of Europe, and especially with Great Britain, seeing as how it took off here on a much earlier and also a much bigger scale, and did not, of course, have cycling, but sports like football, like cricket, as its main catalysts. What's also interesting is, I think, that in Belgium, the influence from the French situation on the development of the sports press was much bigger than the influences coming from Britain.